Welcome back. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for this session, Professor Dr. Marianne Klemun from Vienna University. Professor Klemun holds a PhD in modern history from the University of Vienna. She was appointed professor in the Department of History of the University of Vienna in 2002. Professor Klemun is the author of more than 200 publications in history of science. From 2006 to 2012, she was Vice Dean of the Faculty of Historical and Cultural Studies of the University of Vienna, and from 2016 to 2020, served as Secretary General of the INHIGIO. Her research fields include cultures, practices, and political contexts of the history of natural history, spaces of knowledge, communication, and circulation. Professor Klemun is now going to share some of the results of her research into the contribution of Haast to the New Zealand court at the Vienna World Fair, or Wiener Weltausstellung of 1873. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Marianne Klemun.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and also Simon, for organizing this wonderful and very, very interesting conference. And I would like to thank you that you give us the possibility to join you here in New Zealand. Thank you so much. I want to start with a quote. Of all countries, the Twin Islands of New Zealand stood out particularly an account of the richness of the display of the enormous variety of the natural products and the special catalogue, and with scientific names, quote end. In my talk today, further public reactions will be examined for the first time. Firstly, by way of introduction, I shall present some information on the World Exhibition in Vienna and the aims and preparation in which James Hector, Ferdinand Hochstetter, and Julius Haast were involved as natural scientists. Their commitment concerning the display and the Moa skeletons and their promotion of the natural environment of New Zealand should be considered as decisive for the public success of the exhibition. In this presentation, I shall open a broader perspective on world exhibitions from the point of view of a historian of science by focusing on the entanglement between nature and culture, objects and inscriptions, experts and laymen. I shall aim an understanding of world exhibitions that not only promotes economic determinism, but also connects materials, landscapes, and knowledge in a comprehensive perspective as an interplay with the audience. I shall argue that natural objects and their inscriptions came into power as media at the peak of collecting and musealization. Lists in catalogues and labels provided an interface between objects and their perception. World exhibitions were no doubt platforms. I hear always a sound behind. Somebody speaks, so yeah. World exhibitions were no doubt platforms of nationalism, imperialism, consumerism, exotic, technical advance, and sciences. Semantically and visually, monumentalisms, abundance, speed, figures, statistics, expansion, and topicality were associated with each other and merged into a phantasmagoria. World exhibitions were heightened through the science of the new epoch. Machines and materials, coal and iron, all owing their significance to the idea of progress. Entertainment through knowledge, presentation, and identity, creating patterns of competition and comparison between nation states were striking phenomena, marking a new level of internationality. The World Exhibition in Vienna was accommodated in the Prater, like a city on the outskirts of a city in an area of 233 hectares. 16 hectares was devoted to the construction of many new buildings. In terms of space, the World's Fair surpassed that in Paris in 1867 by a factor of 5. In the Austrian press, the exhibition was hailed as a, quote, image of the culture of our time and a testimony to the unity of the monarchy's ethnic groups. One believed that that one was in awe of the palace of industry, the Rotunde, in a church of civilization, quote end. And in this Rotunda, one of the Moa skeletons was exhibited. Industry was a main driver of the exhibition, embodied in the opulent building of the German company group and the machine hall. Resource awareness was reflected in a building on agriculture. Japan, Persia, and Ottoman Empire, and I have to add New Zealand, played a greater role at the Vienna World Exhibition than ever before. This was based on the Habsburg monarchy's geopolitical orientation towards the Orient, Orientalism, but also on the intensive knowledge-based contacts as a result of the expert of scholars, geologists, and lawyers who worked in these empires. And we have to think about Hochstetter's expedition, which also formed the foundation for global networks that manifested themselves in the exhibition. The invited nations, of course, determined the orientation of their own specific exhibition. As one of 40 British colonies, out of which only 11 was represented in Vienna, the colonial administration for New Zealand considered it a must to participate. And you see in my PowerPoint these arguments why it was very important. When Philip Cunliffe Owen, the English member of the exhibition committee accredited in London, inquired in New Zealand whether they were subordinate to the organization in London or whether they wanted to take the matter into their own hands, the latter was affirmed and emphasized by New Zealand's authorities, quote, as it is important that New Zealand should retain its distinctive characters in the proposed collective representation of the Australasian groups, quote, end. So to distance themselves both from the other British colonies and from the colonial power in London was an ordinarily wise decision, because in fact the other colonies of Great Britain were less careful in running their exhibition, which was in any case observed in the official report published in Vienna. It was also important for researchers like Julius Haast to build up their international authority independently of the scientific center in London. In any case, the mother country was judged by the press in Vienna to be rather inactive. The government in London commissioned Charles Clifford and Isaac Earl Featherstone, both living in London, both of whom were to organize, to accompany, and to represent the exhibition in Vienna. Haast, Hochstetter's friend and best authority on geology and ornithology, was disappointed at the decision, as he had actually expected to be nominated for the position. In London, however, the last word was reserved for the case of the selection of the commissioners. At the last moment, the center in London interfered in an irritating and time-delaying manner and sent objects selected as well in London to Vienna. That the Moa giants had not yet arrived at the opening in May 1st caused a problem. Until the arrival of the skeletons in July, a footprint of the moa caused a sensation, a mysterious preserved trace which tempted an observer also to discuss the Maori as an endangered ethnic group owing to the British colonialism so despised in Austria. And I think this is based on Hochstetter's book about New Zealand, where this discourse is manifest. With the English presentation, while the English presentation in the catalogue for the Vienna World Fair particularly promoted migration, this aspect did not go down well in the Viennese press. Rather, there was a warning against it. And with regard to natural research, however, Vienna, as a third player between London, or a neutral player between London and the colony, was to play the role of mediator as a result of the scientific and friendly relations between, or ongoing relations, very long existing relations between the actors, between Hochstetter and Haast, and according to the Austrian critiques about the British colonialism. Come to my next point, the influence of the naturalists. Long before and in good time, Hochstetter has already contacted his friend Julius Haast in February 1872 and asked about New Zealand's plans for the Vienna World Fair, and personally encouraged him to participate. Hochstetter was one of 216 members of the Vienna Organizing Committee and involved in 3 of 26 thematic sections. He was also a well-known figure, as you know all, an authority, not only an authority in Vienna through the Novara expedition and with his New Zealand book, but also an excellent networker within this city. So in this respect, his influence on the design of this part of the exhibition was central. He wrote to Haast, I have told our general director of the exhibition all about what you want, what you wrote concerning this, and so on. So he had his influence. And there were a lot of negotiations between New Zealand and Vienna, and Hochstetter pledged his support many times, as it was a thematic focus from which he himself could once again publicly consolidate his already existing authority. Dr. James Hector, the chief government scientist, had prepared a memorandum making minute suggestions in advance for the arrangements of the objects in Vienna. The order was, if you look at this, my PowerPoint, you see the order was significant and proved the economic priority, the trade priorities from wool down to the moa skeletons. But I think it's the influence of Hochstetter that the attention was drawn, especially to the natural objects in the press, in the Viennese press. Also, although the natural scientists were successfully involved in the run-up to the exhibition, especially Hector and Haast, they were not completely successful in the end. At the same time, the organization of the exhibition was determined by hierarchical structures, differences between center and colony, and influenced by various interests, and which did not meet the heart of the scientific intentions of the naturalists, especially of Hochstetter, who wrote to Haast. Thanks to Sasha, I can read these letters from Hochstetter to Haast. Quote, as far as the rest of the New Zealand exhibition is concerned, I had a number of battles with Mr. Bevan, who was given the task from London to arranging it without even knowing New Zealand. Quote end. what had Hochstetter actually done regarding the Moa skeletons? He wrote that his ambition to produce the reconstruction of Moas so truthfully required an extremely large effort. So he wrote to Haast, I have now spent 4 quiet weeks working on the bones and skeletons every day, together with 5 other people, quote end. Great attention was given by Hochstetter to the reconstruction and completing of the bones with plaster cast and the arrangement in order to realize a maximum of visibility. In 1861, he has given already a presentation in Vienna about the extinction of the large-scale birds in Darwinian manner and the reconstruction of the skeletons and the construction of a plaster model. Both were dedicated to the Geological Survey in Vienna and prepared by Gustav Jäger, who had also a Darwinian scholar in Vienna, who had described the procedure very intensively. When the Moas were exhibited then in July in the exhibition, in a detailed article responding to the many questions from the public, Hochstetter himself affirmed that these 3 exhibited skeletons were indeed made of real bones, and not only of a fourth was a cast from a find he had made together with Haast in cave in 1859. So, and he describes in this letter very, very intensively how he has organized the exhibition. He put the birds in a court so they were really seen very good. And Hochstetter oriented the mountain of pieces exhibited by Haast at the Canterbury Museum. I don't want to go into this story about the Moa discovery. I think it's well known in New Zealand, but I want to mention that a third space between Owen's claim in London being a center of calculation and Haast's dependency as a scientist at the periphery with supportive position to the center, as Burton has argued in an article, Vienna became a symbolic role for underlying Haast's and Hochstetter's ongoing significance and fame. It was very important, the glory of them in this world exhibition. It is no coincidence that the press in Vienna emphasized that London does not yet have such a complete skeleton as Vienna. And the press was full of praise of this one. And we have always mentioned Hochstetter and Haast in this respect. The Moa skeletons were hybrid natural and cultural objects that captivated scientists and laymen alike. On the one hand, they raised unresolved paleontological questions. On the other hand, they fascinated because of their monumentality and uniqueness. They broadened the public view of the general phenomenon of extinction in the animal world. They allowed Maori legends to be integrated as facts into natural history research, and they intertwined human history and natural history. They were objects that could also publicly advertise the importance of paleontology as a young science. It was noticed that hardly any paleontological collections at the exhibition was exhibited only in connection with stone suites that served to explain the geological maps about New Zealand. One exception was the Moa fossils on display, according to one journalist who described them as the, quote, most striking feature of the whole exhibition, quote end. Sensation, novelty, instructive entertainments were served by the skeletons analogous to the plant star of the exhibition, Welwitschia mirabilis huca, newly discovered in Angola by Austrian, exhibited by Portugal, and pointing to as living fossil. Naturalists and also journalists particularly appreciated the fact that the abundance of materials and specimens on display were labeled with perfect descriptions in terms of content and taxonomy. And they complained that this labeling was not done in all parts of the exhibition, but it was done in the part regarding New Zealand. The corresponding labels for the object had been prepared in New Zealand with suitable show cards, as it was written. The corresponding labels for the object had been prepared in New Zealand, and the unmistakable identification of natural object had become a sign of professionalism in collections, in museums, in botanical gardens since the end of the 18th century, and was guaranteed by markings. The labels had a contemporary character in their consistent execution, depending on the material, language, script, typeface, and political local reference. Unlike the spoken word, which ran and runs in the succession of time, the typeface on the labels lived from the simultaneity of the surface as from the synopsis of the overview. We can see that in this image when we see, so this is what I mean with this, the simultaneity of the surface, and as from the synopsis of the overview, you follow the inscriptions and the objects as with the view. Labels are not only signifier, as significant in relation to the signifying natural object, the significat, but material carriers of a signifying concept that naturalists choose in relation to scientifically negotiated agreements. Popularly, they were analogized with citizens who were, quote, all provided with baptismal certificates and legitimation cards with passports, quote, end. It was the labels that traveled as concrete knowledge and inscribed themselves in reception, mediated through the catalogs and even in newspaper articles. The labels networked the horizon of meaning. The high print run of 500,000 copies of the German catalog did its part, and all these catalogs were also translated. There are three levels that the contemporaries in the press mentioned as the aims of the exhibition: to boost sales, business, competition between the states, including a show of performance by means of objects, and sensationalism by means of news. These were realized at the exhibition via different media in order to attract the attention of the public. Accordingly, three different types of communication are effective as systems of record. Firstly, the list, the index of exhibiting companies, donator, objects in the catalogs. Secondly, the visual representation of landscapes in drawings, photographs, and maps arranged according to states. And thirdly, the abundance of materials and specimens on display, which in the best case were provided with perfect descriptions of content and taxonomy on labels. Extensive lists of exhibitors and objects were indebted as an order to the extremely widespread statistical manuals, Staatenkunde, popular since the 18th century. It was no coincidence that one critique of the exhibition regarding New Zealand had described, quote, statistics as history that has come into a standstill, and meant, in the same sense that international warfare could be described as statistics come to life. However, the critique also feared not everyone, quote, not everyone is in a position to gauge and appreciate from the numerous individual manifestations, quote, end. For this very reason, the British catalogue provided extensive information on the double colony from which the press drew its knowledge. The daily newspapers praised this diversity of natural products and the many types of coal, alluvial gold, and 30 samples from the many locations, the wheat and the wool. And it was said that regarding the wood, there were, quote, 28 from Auckland in the press, 82 from Wellington, 43 from the South Island, making a total of 113 pieces. So this example shows us vividly how the numbers in the lists in the register from the catalogues were transformed into powerful gens of the objects and manifested in the press. The geographical physical uniqueness of the double island was ensured by geological and topographical maps, sections, landscape representation, photographs, materials, and natural objects. At the same time, the public privileged the perspective of the European who was always assessing the world. Accordingly, Joseph Lorenz in Vienna judged Haast's map, titled Map of the Interior of the Province of Canterbury, New Zealand, a hand drawing, to be the best, the most interesting map of its kind among the, quote, maps of all nations exhibited. The physical representation were the photographs and drawings. You see here the list in the PowerPoint about the 56 photographs from Daniel Mundy were shown. So I have chosen one to show it to you. They were exhibited, and this is the list of Haast's contributions in the exhibition. What was mostly received as characteristic of New Zealand's nature was especially the birds and the fact of extinction of some species. And this was told again and again, the connection between the special birds, the kiwi, and the extinction of the animals, which was a very important point as a result of the dissemination of knowledge about New Zealand. I want to come to my conclusion. The analysis of organization or preparation of the New Zealand's part of the Vienna's World Fair in 1873 has shown the powerful ambiguity between the imperial center in London and the supportive position of colonial contributors. It made obvious how a third space in between, the Vienna World Fair, undermined via the important international event the controlling authority of the colonial center and the focus on trade and industry. This perspective was semantically tangible as well in the newspapers. There was a shift from the object from trade to the objects to natural objects. In the press, the agency of a worldwide admired debates and researched fossil, the Moa skeletons, became a central function not only for claiming scientific authority for an expert as Haast was and his patron Hochstetter, but for an architect of the exhibition who articulated the skeletons and birds in the right manner, giving them and him authenticity and credibility. Hector, Hochstetter, and Haast had global connections as friends and scientists who exchanged their knowledge and objects. This underlined the importance of natural objects at the exhibition and also strengthened their and the object status in society and science. The exhibition visualized not only objects but also networks between New Zealand and Vienna, according to the press. The focus on inscriptions, labels, and lists, drawing or photographs helped to understand how knowledge was disseminated. The different functions were established by distinct types of practice. Catalogs and labels, registers, connecting objects and their agency between knowledge and perception. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful paper. It is fascinating to see how New Zealand was able to feature so prominently on the international stage in Vienna and the positive influence of Haast on this undertaking. I am thrilled that you were able to join us today. An auspicious day, not only as Haast's 200th birthday, but also most fittingly on the 149th anniversary of the opening of the Wiener Weltausstellung on the 1st of May, 1873.
Yes.
Thank you so much.